Hi, and welcome back to History for Today. This afternoon, I had a conversation on Zoom with a friend of mine, Nick, who is previously a student of mine. Now he's a colleague. We are in a open education resource learning circle together, and he's also in a PhD program where he is doing a project on research techniques. So he interviewed me for a while, for about 24 minutes, about research, and then I interviewed him for a little while about his choices and his process in thinking about what he wants to do with a PhD. And so this first part of this will be about my answers to his questions about research. And then shortly in the future, I will do a second episode of this where Nick answers my questions about his decisions. So I hope you find this interesting. Thanks for watching.
And so I'm just going to go through my questions, and I'll kind of give a synopsis of what you had shared and just kind of go from there, and we'll just kind of have an organic conversation about it. So, my first question is that you indicated, you've conducted research, and you said towards your dissertation in history and towards a subsequent book project. So I'm just curious if you'd be willing to share, what was the dissertation in history? What was the theme or the focus?
The dissertation was about rural business, actually. So it was sort of I was interested in rural life. I was previously an economist, and I had been in business for about 20 years. So I sort of brought all of those things to it. And actually, what it was the peppermint oil industry in first Ashfield, Massachusetts, which is close to UMass, where I went to school. And I was already doing research there, and I sort of discovered the fact that they had been the first center of the peppermint oil industry. And then it went out from there to Western New York, and then it went out to Southwestern Michigan. And so I followed the families that way. So it was very much of a family business. So it had elements of the story of the Yankee migration across what became the Midwest in the early 19th century, and then business histories. There's a big chapter of banking history in there. So I got to kind of play with a bunch of different kind of themes. So and I was also able to tell the story of some really kind of quirky and interesting characters who I called the Peppermint Kings. And actually they called themselves Peppermint Kings. So I just grabbed that name and used it as my title.
Now, how did you find the information?
I was researching another guy who lived in Ashfield. And as I was sort of reading through at the Ashfield Historical Society, I was reading through letters and archival documentary stuff. And then also at another archive in Deerfield, which is down closer to the Connecticut River, about 15 miles from there. I just found this other character named Samuel Ranney, who I liked. And he was very interesting, very quirky guy. And it turned out that he was associated with this peppermint oil business. He was the guy who brought peppermint to Ashfield in the first place. So peppermint had this sort of a little slightly more than 2 decades of a kind of a golden age of Ashfield, when it really put them on the map. And so this guy, Samuel Ranney, brought it, and he sort of took it away at the end too. So yeah, it was entirely accidental.
Huh.
So that's the other part of sort of the research and the archival stuff, is that when you go into these archives, you just find stuff that you have to really go in with an open mind, because you just find stuff that you were not expecting to see at all.
And so it was more of an organic process where you didn't necessarily from the beginning of your program know, hey, I'm going to research this, and then you did it. I mean, you started your research and you kind of just stumbled too, and you found this was interesting, and there was enough meat on the bone there to do some research.
Yeah, actually, before I ever got in the PhD program, I was writing a biography of a secularist radical in London, and he was attached to this other guy who lived about 50 years before him in Ashfield, Massachusetts. And so I was already going to Ashfield, and I was already tracking down this guy, Dr. Charles Knowlton. And then I got into the PhD program, and then I continued doing research in Ashfield, because I think I had been there even before I started, because I was thinking I was going to write biography of one or both of these guys, because that was my initial interest, was to be a nonfiction author not to get a PhD in history.
Huh. Then how did you get into the PhD route?
Well, UMass was my alma mater. That may have given me a little bit of a leg up. I went in and I took a biography. They had a graduate level biography elective that was being offered one semester, and I went down and I took it. And then I said, well, I'd like to continue this. And they they thought I was doing good work. So it was hard sort of elbowing my way into the program because it was a fairly competitive program. I had a master's, but it was a terminal master's from Mankato. So it didn't, put me on the obvious track.
Interesting. So did you travel to the archives, or were you doing a lot of this electronic? I don't know when you got your PhD and how much was online.
A lot of it was online, but I got my PhD in 2017, but I was doing this research between 2009 and 2012. And then I took, basically 5 years off. I said it was a decade, but it was really 5 years I took off. Felt like a decade. And, but I went to Ashfield. None of that was digitized. That was all paper in manila folders. I went to the Cornell archives for the Western New York part of it, and I went to Kalamazoo for the Michigan part. Yeah, so I did a lot of physical paper research. Took a lot of photographs. Actually, that was the digital part of what I did. Was I didn't sit there and read everything and write notes. I just took thousands and thousands of photographs of things, and then came home and transcribed handwritten letters and all of that.
Okay. So you completed your core courses in your doctoral program, and then 5 or 6 years where you were ABD.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my other question. So you in terms of, were you working the whole time in that process, or how much time do you think you were really hitting that dissertation, working, making progress towards it?
I started the program there in 2009, and by 2011 I had taken my comps, so I was ABD then. And then I was going to write it. I was going to do it, and my advisor told me to slow down.
Huh?
She told me to slow down. She said it would seem like I hadn't worked hard enough if I had actually finished it that fast, because I was on the way. I was going to finish it in a year.
Yeah.
And so, so she said, slow down. So I said, well, okay, I got nothing to do. We don't want to live in, this expensive house in Keene, New Hampshire anymore. We're going to move back to Minnesota. So I moved up here in 2012, ABD. And then I applied for a bunch of jobs and didn't really get any nibbles that first round in like 2012. And then I sort of put it out of my mind, and I did other things, and I had other sources of income, so I wasn't worried about trying to be a history teacher. So then I kind of came back to it in, I guess, 2016, and I decided maybe I would like to do this. So I finished it up, and it took me at that point, it took me like 9 months to finish it, because I had to write each of the chapters and send it to my advisor, a chapter a month, and he would return it to me. And so that took about 9 months to get the writing all kind of done. I had all of the research in the can. I mean, it was all it really was just kind of putting the pieces together. So yeah, and then I finished. I went back, I defended it, and I think I got my PhD in, I think it was 27. I don't know. It's on the wall. I think it was 2017. September 1st, 2017. And then this is the book that came out of it.
Okay, so you actually were able to publish a book.
Yeah, so I was able to. One of my other advisors, who was a guy from Amherst College named Ted Malillo, he had published his book through the Yale University Press, because he had been a Yale graduate. And so he introduced me to the acquisition editor at the Yale Press. And so, so I submitted it there. And that was really where the whole peer evaluation thing came from, because Once you've got, then you have to do a proposal, and you have to give them sample chapters and everything. They send it out to 3 people. So those are really your peers at that point. And they're all people who have published something similar. But yeah, this was, the Yale Press is one of the 2 or 3 best publishers for history in America. And this is the Agrarian Studies series. So this is like right down this, its alley. So yeah, so I was very lucky.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be a nice book.
Mm-hmm.
And it came out in, God, I don't know when it came out, in the spring, like May or June. And nothing much has happened because the Yale Press has like gone out of business for COVID. So as far as marketing goes, I don't think that they've been, really pushing it at all, which is unfortunate. But
no royalties yet, then.
No, yeah, they only account every like 6 months. So yeah, I haven't even seen my first statement yet.
So is that the book? I mean, because you're doing the OER stuff too. I mean, are you doing research for that book too?
No, well, no. This I had already written an environmental history textbook, so that was like my first.
Okay.
So that was what I used in that online class. Mm-hmm. And that was the first thing that I turned into an OER. I had always sort of been interested in self-publishing anyway. I had self-published a young adult novel, before I ever went back to UMass. And so, so I always thought that traditional publishing was, kind of on its last legs.
My wife is actually self-publishing, working on a novel right now. So she's in that process. And of course, the hard part is just the discipline to continue to write. She's writing a historical fiction book about 2 women in the Revolutionary War times. And so, it's kind of a modern, probably a modern, feminist view of these 2 women who are coming of age. But then she's doing research in terms of the original events and the places they were, and all of that sort of thing. So she's enjoying the process. But yeah, the hard part is just making the time to do it.
Yeah, I do pretty well with deadlines. So I like having that gun to my head, I guess.
Okay, so in terms of your research, I kind of interpreted, you wrote archival, demographic, oral history interviews. It seems as though, because we're supposed to, in our course, we kind of are learning about 3 different types of research. You have quantitative, which is really about the numbers and analysis. And you have qualitative, which is more about understanding the major themes, by, providing a narrative of what occurred, interpreting narratives. And so from my perspective, it sounds like what you really have in history, to put it in that box, you were doing qualitative research. Would that be, or is it considered quantitative?
No, I would say that reading the letters and stuff in Ashfield and whatnot would have been qualitative. I also did, there was business history in there too.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay.
So I did some work with numbers, and especially with demographics and stuff like that. So so that element of it, I would say, was quantitative. In history, generally, quantitative tends to mean social history, right? Because social historians, are the ones who are always talking about, the people who don't have voices in the regular, in the old-fashioned histories of the great men. So they're the crowd in the background.
Sure.
And, so they often use census and demographics and that type of numerical, quantitative data to try to get to that voter rolls and things like that. So that from a historical perspective, that would be the quantitative type of thing. In both cases, I think you can be narrative in both cases, but even the narrative stuff in history, I would say, would be, there's a difference between sort of primary narratives, of people there who were on the ground at the time, and you take that testimony kind of differently than you do the narratives that historians tell that are kind of filled with interpretation as well.
That's really helpful. Okay, thank you. I did not know that. That does make sense, though, that how you get at some of the voices that didn't have letters or were, they couldn't write or nothing was recorded about them. You use some of that data to get and flesh out some of that information.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah. Like, I mean, if you're like a Southern historian, how do you deal with the slaves who were,
Yeah.
mostly illiterate, were not able to leave
Yeah.
anything behind? So yeah, there are always populations like that in medieval history, the peasants. And yeah. So they call it history from the ground up.
So in terms of the next question, you said you enjoy research. How much of your time at BSU, now that you're teaching a full load, do you spend in research? Like, do you do it mostly on breaks? Do you do it in the summer? Do you do it to prepare for certain lectures? How do you do it?
Yes, all of the above. I do it to prepare for every lecture. So there is an element of, and I mean, especially, yeah, even for the ones I was going to say, especially for courses that are new. Like I've got this Gilded Age and Populism course that I'm teaching for the first time, and I'm actually creating it sort of in real time as I go. So there's a lot of research that goes into that. But even like the modern world history, which I've taught like 9 times, I'm writing the OER this semester too. So there's additional research to kind of add to that. So there's always some research. And then additionally, my next book project is I'm actually doing the secondary research. I'm doing the literature review part of it at this point. But yeah, that's kind of ongoing as well. And that's a part of the whole, PDR process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, that's probably a big difference between a 4-year, a professor and a 2-year community college. I think the 2-year community college and technical college, you're just mostly using the resources from the textbook, or, you're not using those primary resources. At least I don't see my peers doing that. So, I have a number of contacts, friends, acquaintances at the 4-year, and, research is definitely something that's emphasized more to be considered really to be doing a good job as a professor. So
Yeah, well,
that's interesting to me.
and it is possible. And I was going to say phone it in, but I guess I shouldn't say that. It's possible to use a textbook and to use the stuff that's provided in even like a textbook companion primary source reader. So you don't have to go out and find your own stuff all the time. I decided to take the road less traveled, right, and do OER instead. So I took that on as an additional thing. But plenty of people, just use what they've found that they like and then focus on other things like interacting with the students. And there's all kinds of other quality of instruction things that they could, that they can spend their energy on that don't involve additional research.
I have a thing about me, I guess, where if I don't feel like I'm designing it, I don't feel like I'm learning it enough to teach it. So there's an aspect for me, like I came into my courses and like my instructor had all these course management systems from vendors that were just used, right? So I could have just basically pushed play and grade. But I couldn't do that because I just couldn't learn the content and feel like I was really relating it in a way that was helpful to students. Yeah. So some of that was just the way I'm wired too. So I get that.
Right. Yeah. And I think, I mean, even when I was using textbooks, like the first couple of semesters I was here, I was just replacing a professor who had gone out on sick leave. And she had already chosen the textbooks and stuff. But, so I used the textbook that she had chosen. But then I also, looked at other ones and I said, okay, well, this is what Worlds Together, Worlds Apart says. But what about traditions and encounters? So I was reading them, and I was thinking, well, okay, so what can I add in from that? And then what do I actually want to talk about in this period that isn't in either of them? So yeah, it was kind of a dialogue and a kind of a remixing, even with commercially prepared stuff.
Do you have any sort of process in which how you analyze whether something is legitimate? You're doing research, you're reviewing qualitative or quantitative research, and you're like, I don't know. I mean, do you just look to see if it jives with the other stuff? Do you see how many other people cited it? How do you kind of determine whether something's useful or not?
I had that experience just today. I've started for my podcasts. I've started actually doing book reviews, and a lot of the books that I'm starting with are books that I read when I was a grad student, like 10 years ago. And I'm finding that, like one that I reviewed today. As I was looking at it, and I was thinking, this guy is way too accepting of these sort of historical myths, like, the Turner thesis about the frontier and the sort of declensionist history of New England. And so that's one of the clues is, if somebody seems to be channeling a movement like that, or kind of a grand narrative, right? But the thing that really struck me about it was that when I was a first year grad student, PhD student at UMass, I read it pretty naively and kind of accepted a lot of what he was saying, and didn't really throw a lot of grains of salt at it. And so I think partially it just comes kind of from experience, from having enough of, I guess the thing that I would say is different about me now, 10 years later, is that I've just read more, and I have more, kind of more of my own ideas, having read some primary things and having done some of my own research about some stuff that I don't know that he's wrong about, but that I suspect. Up until that point, up until you have that information of your own, then I think you have to be sensitive to tone and to where, especially, I had an economics professor once who would get up, he'd be up at the chalkboard and he'd be going like crazy. And he said, and this is the moment when my hand leaves my wrist, because you don't get, you got A, B, C, X, Y, Z, and and the stuff in between is missing. And so I see that a lot, I think, in a lot of histories where people, where they don't show their work, that's problematic. And where they don't, and that kind of goes to your middle questions about the downsides of, of quantitative and qualitative. Both of them can have their downsides. The qualitative thing is that hand leaves the wrist thing. It's that sort of, I'm gonna buy into this grand narrative, whether it's, Turner's frontier thesis or Marx's historical determinism, or, whatever it is. And then you're molding your expectations of evidence to fit this sort of pre-interpretation. And that's very problematic.
Yeah.
So I think that's something, when I'm reading about something that I don't have an idea about already, that's one of the things when warning bells start to go off. When there's too much generalization, or when there is sort of overgeneralization from very anecdotal evidence, right? And there are historians. There's one who I really like a whole lot, Carlo Ginzburg. He argued for what he called microhistory, and it was almost like biography. It was very, very thick description, was the term he used, of an individual case. And you were supposed to, and the implication was that this guy that he was using as his example, sort of stood for a type. And while I like that, it's also dangerous, right? Because how do you prove that guy actually does stand for his cohort? I've got to really trust that author.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the idea of some people start with preordained ideas about what happens, and then they make the data fit towards what their argument is. And as I've been thinking about dissertation topics, I've had that too. Like, well, Nick, do you think you know the answer already? If you know the answer, why are you asking the question? Or if you or just come at it from a different lens instead of thinking it's going to be effective or not effective. Think about it. Just, are you measuring it in a way that you have the potential to be right or wrong about it? So being open to that, I that's been a concern of mine too. Because part of me just is like, I really want to get this done. So I want to get to something I know I can do. But on the other hand, it's like, well, that's not necessarily ethical, and it may not be approved by my, institutional review board either. So,
Yeah. And actually, you're gonna have a lot more. I didn't have an IRB because I wasn't doing any of that type of quantitative research. I was not surveying people or doing that type of statistical or quantitative stuff. So that would be challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see.